Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We've got another day, day 5 of the Inspire Education Summit, and you are very welcome here today. We might be at the end of the week, but we are not at the end of the summit programme. We still have 4 sessions left to go and an exciting announcement to make. I'm Alex O'Neill, host of the Limitless Changemakers podcast, and I'm so proud to be bringing you this summit alongside Joe Symes from Progressive Education. Together, we have a dream to unite those who want to bring about change in education systems across the world, to spark inspiration and to support you to take action. Next Monday, the 25th of November, at the very last session of the summit, we're launching a brand new membership platform for the education startups, a place where those who've been inspired to create their own school or learning community can gather together and learn from experts to make their idea a reality. Our work has already inspired and supported some people to launch their own learning spaces, and we want to bring this knowledge and community you need to do this to you. Come along to the summit session on Monday evening to find out more, or look out for details in your emails about this exciting new platform next week. I've been struck over the years of being involved in education work at some of the stories that I've heard about young people not being able to access a decent education in the UK and across the world. There are so many individual stories and challenges, every young person with their own unique perspective on life that might involve anxiety, neurodiversity, carer responsibilities, disability or mental health challenges for themselves or their families. Any number of difficult, challenging reasons may stop a young person attending school. And whilst there are stories of schools that make way for individual circumstances, there are far too many children that are lost, punished and marginalised for their experiences. For me, the attendance policies and requirements that schools have to adhere to have been a real shock. I've been reading various news articles about the strategies schools have been using to keep kids in school. Everything from large carrots like day trips and awards for those with 100% attendance for the year, to large sticks, such as social isolation. To be honest, I thought these policies were restricted to only a very few and very strict schools, until my daughter went to secondary school this year. I was shocked to find a 100% attendance reward system in place, break time detentions for even being a few minutes late, literally like 1 or 2 through the door, and amazingly, an entire team of staff dedicated to managing attendance. It made me think, firstly, how much pressure kids are under to get themselves through the door, despite everything that might be going on for them at home. And also the intense pressure the school must be under to force these kids in these ways to come to somewhere where we would hope they're enjoying their childhoods and sparking learning opportunities, but clearly it's not where many of them want to be. When I first interviewed Ellie Costello for my podcast back in 2022, I was struck by not only her poignant story of her child's challenges with accessing school, but the power and determination she had to fight for the rights of all children to access an education that suits them. I am so pleased to be welcoming her today alongside Adam and Chris to talk about their work together. Ellie Costello is Executive Director at Square Peg, an organisation that effects cultural and systemic change on behalf of all children who experience barriers to school attendance. She is co-author of the critically acclaimed book Square Pegs, Compassion, Inclusion and Fitting In, A Guide for Schools, and is Parliamentary Vice Co-Chair of the Council for Disabled Children's Special Education Consortium. Adam Vasco is Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Wolverhampton and is deeply committed to working towards eliminating inequality and promoting diversity, inclusion and belonging in all aspects of education. He's worked for over 2 decades in the educational sector, ranging from early years through to primary, secondary and now higher education, and is currently finalising his doctoral research on cultural competence in education. And finally, Dr. Chris Bagley, who's also with us today, started his career as a secondary school teacher and is now a practitioner psychologist, mostly in the youth justice sector. Chris is a lecturer, tutor, and doctorate research supervisor on the Child and Adolescent Educational Psychology course at the Institute of Education at University College London, and a non-executive director of Square Peg, joining in 2022. He is director of research at States of Mind and has written numerous journal articles, book chapters, and opinion pieces in the national media. So with those three fantastic bios, I'd like to welcome Ellie, Chris, and Adam to the screen. So please share your screen, and I can't wait to hear their fascinating conversation that they're going to bring to us today.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's a real delight to be here. And I think what you guys have achieved this week is absolutely remarkable, really extraordinary, and so accessible for everybody as well. So thank you for putting so much work into it and making it look so easy, because I know it isn't. So we're here today to talk about each of our areas of work and how they dovetail, but also to explore and help raise some awareness about the themes that are washing over many of us, why they're there, why we need to know about them, and what we can do to navigate them, but also build and learn from them and pivot and co-create what happens next. So I'm so pleased to be here with two of my favourite people who also happen to be associates at Square Peg and are helping me to take Square Peg to the next phase on our journey. And they've both got such brilliant minds. I always love being around them because there's so much that we end up riffing on and exploring and unpicking. Yeah, so the first thing that we are going to be talking about, I thought that we've got two such massive themes to explore here, because on the one hand, Chris's work, both in terms of looking back in order to understand why we are where we are now, and in order to look forward, we need to really debunk and break down some of those challenges. And Adam's work in terms of thinking about the intersectionality and the challenges that are there, but also how through becoming culturally competent, we can actually ensure that we are building systems that are truly co-creative as well, and are alert to the historical context that Chris is going to talk about, and those themes and challenges that we just accept are true as truths, I think are incredibly exciting to come together and share today. And then I'm hoping to sort of feed in a few little bits as to what those solutions might look like, but also how they feel for families as well. So, Chris, I guess the first thing that whenever we meet, Chris is such an enormous mine of information. And I said to him, I said, how about we just go back to the beginning and do a brief history of time, education, culture, and practice. But one of the things that we were talking about, Chris, was there are certain themes, aren't there, and patterns that are woven through our societies and culture that are so deeply embedded that we just accept them as being there. But I think one of the things that you are helped me to understand is that actually we can stretch our thinking around why they're there, and perhaps start to move towards a way that is beyond those irrefutable truths. Is that helpful place to start in any way? It sounds like a lot of word salad. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be an invitation for us to start having a chat. And the other thing is, please do put any comments or thoughts in the chat, and we will try to keep an eye on that as well. We're going to have a deep stretch conversation now, and then allow lots of time for us to speak together collectively as a group at the end.
Thanks, Ellie. So I guess I should launch into the entire history of education in 10 minutes. I'll give it a go, guys. I think one of the things that's really interesting about what we've got with schooling at the moment is, as Ellie's just pointed out, it very much reflects society. You can't really disassemble schooling from society, and the structures that society is marinated in are ones that also find their way into schools. And what seems to be happening at the moment, in my personal opinion, I'll be interested in other people's views on this later, is this idea that schooling, certainly in the latter part of the 20th century, post-World War II, should be something, particularly in the 70s onwards, that should be formulated around equity, or what we would generally call inclusion. But the school system is entirely grounded in a very severe and brutal form of elitism. So that's the history of schooling. So we've got these two sort of competing ontologies, or ways of thinking about what being and acting are in the schooling space. And they don't mix. They're constantly clashing. And I would imagine a lot of people on this call are very interested in things like self-directed learning, making sure the young people are consenting, rights respecting education. Very difficult to do that in schools. And that's not because teachers are evil. It's because we have a lot of structures here that are very deeply embedded. And I thought I'd go through one of the structures, and there are many others. Curriculum is one, and I call this the myth of right knowledge. This idea there always has to be a rigid, codified, pre-designated curriculum that everyone must learn, otherwise everything falls to pieces. That's another theme that I don't have time to touch on today. And another one is, what is an individual? What does an individual do? Who are you as an individual? My view is we don't exist without each other, and we only become an individual in a nested set of relationships. But again, that's not how schooling is formulated. It's a hyper-individualized, consumer-driven culture. But we don't have time for those. So I thought I'd talk about another one, which is a bit easy to get your head around and probably a bit easy to explain in 5 minutes, which is what I used to call it the myth of three, but now I'm thinking more sort of the order of three is a better way of defining it. And I started thinking about this when I've been a psychologist, mostly in PRUs and prison contexts and the youth justice sector. And before that, I was a teacher, and I usually taught horrible phrase, bottom set children, which I found very repugnant at the time. And I started thinking about this sort of 10, 15 years ago when I was a teacher, and really noticing so many triads within the school system. So we have setting and streaming, right? Schools are constantly talking about top, middle, and low attainers. That's a triad. When you look at the way everything's measured, what you'll find is those who are in schools will know that schools are measured around progress 8. So that's measured on a normal distribution, which is obviously a graph that goes like this with a peak in the middle, with some schools being high attaining, most being average, and some being low attaining. Another triad, divisible into 3. And if you look at paperwork that the government's put out, it's got red, amber, and green to designate those 3 forms of attainment. If you look at standardized assessment, whether this is SATs or IQ tests, normal distribution is there again. And in IQ tests, it's got superior, average, and low, or borderline. And you can just see this everywhere. When you look at behavior in schools, parents who get reports, you'll see often a traffic light system, red behavior, amber behavior, or green good behavior. You'll see it with progress, tripartite on tripartite, like layers and layers of tripartites. And I started to think, well, why is this sort of data-driven, segregated form of defining humanity come to pass? How have we got here? Because it's clearly harmful, because it's always the same young people who are at the bottom end of this. It's always the same schools who are at the bottom end of this. And the way that our system is structured through high stakes examinations and accountability means that has to happen. You have to have losers. Not everyone can be a winner. So I started to think, well, where's this come from? And then going back through history to look at it in a little bit more depth. And if you go back to sort of post-World War II, some of you may remember even the tripartite system, which was put in place post-World War II. And that was the first time that education for all was designated as even a legitimate human right for all. So, but that was designed based on the idea of 3 types of mind. So grammar school kids, technical school kids, and working class kids. The idea being that some people are born innately intelligent and others less so. And if you track that back, what you'll find is in the middle of the 19th century, someone called Francis Galton came up with the idea of hereditary ability and started using the normal distribution, that thing I demonstrated earlier, to measure human beings for the first time. And this came sort of at the end of what we'd call the Age of Enlightenment, where you suddenly got science rather than Christianity deciding what constitutes a good person and an intelligent person. And then we had science evaluating human beings rather than Christian morality. So this is a very deeply entrenched system of thinking. And if you track it back a bit further than that, what you're seeing, Protestantism, and Ellie was really keen to talk about religion today, so I'm going to bring in Protestantism now. What came through Protestantism, which is really fascinating, and Adam and I were talking about this in terms of how kids get into schools today. There was a huge paradox at the bottom of Calvinism. And when Calvin founded his city in Geneva in the 16th century, I realize I've skipped 300 years here, guys. It's difficult not to do that in 5 minutes. He essentially, with his colleagues, suggested that some people are destined for salvation and are born with the grace of God. Others we're not sure about, and usually the poor or the destitute, they are there because God has designated them to be there. So that's another triad. And the way that you are able to be shown to have been saved by God is these two ways. And this is the paradox. It's called posterior signs of election, is what Calvin called it. And the only way that people can be seen to have been saved or be savable by God is if they demonstrate piety and learnedness. So we might look at learnedness as directly reflecting the 11 plus, for example, and piety, as Adam and I were talking about the other day, is still a measure of how you get into a school, because some people get into religious schools in Great Britain, and to do that, you have to demonstrate piety for a significant numbers of months before you get in. So those shadows have drifted all the way down the ages. But what Calvinism did and Protestantism did is it fed deeply into hereditary ability, because what you had is deeply Christian people in a scientific world trying to objectify what are essentially Christian constructs. So you get the normal distribution and the division of people into three using science rather than what was formatively religion. So this is very complicated, but you can absolutely track it directly. And before that, I'm nearly there, guys. Before that, you had the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, in what we now call Catholicism, there was a much more rigidly structured social hierarchy that was beyond reproach. And that was based around those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. And you had the hereditary aristocracy jailed with the clergy, and then the working class, the workers, the peasants, artisan class below them. And that was just seen as being completely natural. They wouldn't have used that word, but they would have seen that as an entirely legitimate way of conceiving society. And by the time you get to the 19th century, you've got the landed aristocracy and the bourgeois middle class, and then the workers. So the class system also reflects this tripartite, which then feeds into the educational structures. And I'm going to do a really quick wave backwards now. But if you go right back to the Romans, their society was structured as senators, equestrians, and plebiscite, which was a very rigid tripartite. But even the Celtic world that was in Great Britain before that was absolutely obsessed with triplication. And there's very strong evidence in the Celtic literature, in the philology, of dividing people into three groups there as well. So this is really interesting. It's an Indo-European phenomenon that's been around for a very extended period of time that keeps getting reformulated. So it's not that the Romans came in and introduced this tripartite. The tripartites were there. You have three-headed gods. You have three-headed symbols. Triplication is everywhere as a way of defining the cosmos. And the last couple of bits I'm going to say before I think I should probably stop is probably the most influential human being on the entire history of Western society is Plato. And if you look at the Norwood report in the 1940s, this is an amazing thing. You can look at the cover page of that, the Norwood report, which suggested the tripartite school system. He quotes Plato in Greek on that, talking about some people are destined for a grammar education and some people are not. And he's taken the quote directly from Plato. Plato divided people into gold, silver, and bronze. And he suggested that the gold people are the philosopher kings, the leaders, and the silver are the sort of middle class or auxiliaries of people who would support the upper class. And then you have the working poor, artisans, peasantry. And the last thing I'll just mention, guys, is that this goes back even further than that. And one of the greatest influences on 19th century public schooling was the Plutarch's descriptions of ancient Sparta. And the ancient Spartans divided their society into the Spartan aristocracy, the Perikoi, and the Helot slaves. They deliberately inculcated that idea alongside the idea of hereditary ability to create the first British school system. So you can see this order of three enmeshed in all sorts of different complicated ways. And the last couple of things I'll mention is the first ever schooling culture that's been discovered was in ancient Sumer, which is nearly 5,000 years ago. And scholars have found through reading cuneiform tablets baked into the stone and scratched into the stone that their society was also, and I found this incredible when I learned it, was also divided into 3 social classes. And it was only the top members of the upper echelons of society who became scribes. And those were the ones who were reading amazingly royal praise poetry. They were reading epic hymns. They were reading a very attenuated version of history. So they became the educated elite. So I guess my argument is this goes back nearly 5,000 years, but this is still only a speck of time in human history. So if you read anthropology and archaeological work, you'll see that in the early Iron Age, there's a lot of evidence, and I'm talking mountains of it around the world, of authentically egalitarian societies that didn't necessarily structure themselves in this way. So I guess final word from me on this is I think that the way that our society is structured, particularly around education and societal structures of segregation, it's not fixed. It hasn't always been like this. And a few thousand years in terms of the entire vast cornucopia of human societies is a speck. And what we're doing here, I think, is pushing back against those narratives and trying to change them. Apologies if that was
amazing. It's amazing. I love it. Adam, so yeah, there's so much to riff on, isn't there? But I'm really interested in how your reflections on that, and also how whether or not that, because I would love it if you could mention First Nation and Indigenous peoples as well, but also whether or not that in your work you'll see there are to what extent that is embedded in Eastern philosophy as well, because I think there's anyway.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know about the rest of you, but I could sit and listen to Chris talk about that for a really long time. It's so fascinating. I suppose often when I start sessions with professionals and colleagues, and I always pose the question: what's the purpose of education? What do we, why do we get out of bed in the morning? Why did we come into it? And what do we think we're contributing to? And the reason I asked that, and it links to Chris's order of 3 or myth of 3 or whatever. I don't think it is a myth. I think he's right. I think it's order of 3. And I'm just going to stick into the chat, because from Dr. Naomi Fisher's, can I press that? I think I can, yeah. Naomi Fisher has written in Missing the Mark, one of her posts before, about this idea. Sometimes I imagine a world where we're honest with parents and children about the function of school. We'd say your children have a once-in-a-lifetime chance to enroll in a 12-year competition, and at the end, 30% of them will be deemed as failures, 30% of them successes, and the next in the middle. And it's fixed. There is no change around that. Those percentage, no matter how hard your children work, some of them will fail. And that speaks to some of what Chris is talking about there. That everywhere that we go, that's the sector that we contribute to. Yet, if we were in a room together and I allowed you to talk and say chat to the person next to you, so what's the purpose of education, number one, and then what brought you to it? I don't think any of us get up in the morning and sort of eat our cornflakes going there thinking, great, I can't wait to sort of fail 30% of the children and be part of that journey towards things. And yet it is the system that we are part of, and I don't think there's much argument to say that is the current system we have, the current system in conventional education. And we've just had this conversation about the language even of so most of you and all the attendees at this brilliant conference and summit that you've had for a week, and the people you've been dipping in and out and attending, lots of us probably are being told that we're on the progressive side of education. That's what we are with Prague. And there's this alternative version. And of course, in the alternative version, often the terminology that's used is about this idea of traditional education, but it's not traditional education. It's conventional education here in the UK and in many parts of the Western world. But traditional education, as Joe and Ellie and I and Chris and Alex were all talking about just before we came in, traditional education would be Indigenous education, or the Indigenous forms of education that Indigenous people taken off. It's traditional. There's nothing wrong with that. And we need to be really careful about some of the language that we use. And I don't think that's an accident either. You know, the idea of something being a tradition generally is a good thing, isn't it? We have, you know, in our own culture, we have traditions, family traditions, those things that we do that we hold dear towards us. So I think it's important around these subtleties that we look at what is posed to us as conventional, and you know, make sure that we really play around with that. Or not play around with it, that we really think about it. And that actually links into, so my area of interest is around cultural competency. And I'm really keen to make sure that I don't end up with a word salad as well. And there is a danger when it comes to things like cultural competency, that it's just the latest in a buzzword. So in higher education now, Ellie talked before in her introduction about co-creation. I mean, I hear that used probably on a daily basis in my line of work, and yet I can honestly say I can count on one hand how many times I've been truly involved in a co-creation from the ground up. I read in the chat somewhere, someone was talking about that they attended a leadership course, or they attended some training, and no one was allowed to say what their role was, so they were all equals. Well, if we're going to co-create, that's the type of thing. Hierarchy needs to be removed, and we need to start building from the ground up. So I am aware that things like cultural competency can therefore become very much like, well, it's just the latest thing, playing word salad with things. But Ellie said just before we started this, we do need to make sure that we talked about solutions, and I agree. But the reason why we were so keen, I think, as a three, the order of three,
Triad.
the triad, yes, as a three of us coming together to talk about this, is I think that we've got to go back to understanding the problem before we try to disrupt it, because I think often, and this links with issues with attendance, it links with issues in terms of closing gaps, it links to everything, that we look at this tip of the iceberg all the time. So, well, we've got some things over here, how do we sort that? And of course, underneath that tip of the iceberg is this huge mass that's big enough to sink the Titanic. And until we actually reflect on what is it that's the issue, and the issue is all this historic stuff, then I'm not sure we're in a position to be able to even begin to address it. So let me talk about cultural competence before I hand over to Ellie, so to give some definition of the potential word salad. So it's really important to say that when I talk about culture, that means every single one of us, because every single one of us, everyone brings their own unique cultural experience. It's not about othering or anything else. We all bring our unique experiences. We all belong to different in and out groups, and we all bring a whole host of different lived experiences. And very often, none of those two lived experiences are ever the same. Cultural competence, then, or the journey towards cultural humility, the ideal, I suppose, is that ability to interact effectively with said people from all our different viewpoints. It's not about a hive mind situation where we all have to think the same. I think one of the issues that we have in society and education, and Chris said right at the beginning how those two things mirror each other all the time, they are inextricably linked. We have lost the ability to disagree agreeably, and so we do this thing of polarization, false dichotomies, hence this total false dichotomy of you're either progressive or you're conventional. Well, no, not necessarily. It can be more nuanced than that. Education should be nuanced. And cultural competency is this idea, really, of us being able to unpick some of that nuance. It's about recognizing and valuing cultural difference. And that's really the key there, is the valuing. The recognizing bit, we probably do okay in society, but the valuing part is really important. It's about us adapting behaviors, adapting the way we communicate, adapt the way we practice in different settings, to meet the needs of individuals, whether that's in schools, and we're thinking about our families, thinking about our children and young people. And it involves then a combination of awareness, that first part there, understanding our own cultural identity, understanding our own systems and structures, our own inherent prejudices, because we all have them. Notice I use the term prejudice and not bias. The reason why, if we know about unconscious bias, can it be unconscious? Not really. We know about them. Let's not try and give ourselves a way out. I have prejudices, you have prejudices, and sometimes we act on them. The key is not to act on them. And that, by the way, is really, 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 really difficult, because those prejudices are based on the world and society that we've been brought up in. And so it's unpicking that and recognizing how it influences things. It's about gaining some knowledge and listening to other experiences, centering other people's experiences, authentically allowing time to listen, to understand what things look like. And in education, time, we are very, very time poor. Everything is squashed into this tiny little bit of time. And there's so many things that we've got to get throughout that day. And of course, we're just heading through it in time, but it actually requires some understanding of listening, and attitudes clearly is key. The reason why cultural competence in education, I think, is so interesting, and so when we bring it back to these types of things, is that by very definition, those of us in the room today have navigated this space. If you read on in Naomi Fisher's that missing the mark thing, then there are winners and losers in the go back to this tripartite, and the three of them, the competition. But many of us were the winners in that competition, so we didn't actually see what it was like to be on the other side. That's incredibly difficult, therefore, to be able to center all these different viewpoints. And so when it comes to thinking about children and young people who are being pushed through this system at the moment, that order of three we see everywhere. So we've got even with these ridiculous attendance targets that people are being pushed towards, because we know what's going to happen is that, you know, you almost are going to get that order of three. But this isn't a bell curve on a chart about some tests. This is about that there's a group of one of those groups are people who can't engage. We've created that system, and I think it's that really to say that we can keep on looking for silver bullets for someone to come in and tell us what the answer is, or we can maybe take some steps back. And in my eyes, this is about cultural competency, to look at this system, where we sit within this system, and think about, okay, what can education look like in the context for, I think I saw this in the chat, for our families, for our children and young people. Where do we hear those stories and voices? How are we setting them up to fail within a system? Because that's what none of us have come into. And I know the whole summit's about new paradigms, but those paradigms aren't going to be something you can buy off the shelf, that someone comes and teaches you and says, you know, there we go, that's how we do it. For a million and one reasons, toxic mutations in education, the reason why research informed, dare I say, is so laughable in education is because a classroom is not a lab. So whether it's cognitive science and that the sort of move towards some of those things, or whether it's research into really well-established things, Dylan Willem talks about, you know, the research into homework, for example, tells us homework isn't effective. That's not really right. What we do is really ineffective homework. So it's research informed in education is really, really, really challenging. So yes, new paradigms, and yes, you can accuse me of word salad and everything else, but it's about us going back in our settings as leaders, as teachers, as staff, working with our communities to go back and think, what does this look like for our context to help and support? Whose stories and narratives and voices are missing from that? If we are co-creating because we are trying to do something for our families, our communities, we get out of bed in the morning to do something good, I assume, especially of those of us on the progressive side, then how do we do that? And I think it's about having some of those conversations. And so to bring back to Ellie, one of the reasons why sort of we've come together is me being on the receiving end and reading that book and reading those stories and being really keen to do something about that as a movement, I suppose, to be able to challenge, because we are stronger together. That there is no doubt about that. And you heard and listened to Ellie where she sits and manages to do some things around lobbying and those things. I think that's absolutely essential. but also for us not to look at an Ellie or someone over there to do this for us. How do we do that in our settings? And my own work, we've built upon lots of different people's ideas. Terry Cross's own cultural competence continuum, which was around about health. I've made that more about education, and it's as a framework to guide conversation. And what does that look like in our setting? We've adapted it for Square Peg, because again, what does that look like around those issues around attendance? But I'm also cautious of waffling on here, Ellie. So hopefully you've got something to be able to riff off and play your own tune.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just love the two hands actually that have just sort of been holding us in conversation. I really, really love it. And I think for me there is there's several things. So firstly, the rights of the child is something that is being discussed in earnest, right? And at pace. We've got a big piece of work happening. I know that Richard Frensham and the new group that's sprouting up there about children's rights-based education is happening, but it's also happening as well in a really meaningful way with in London is adopting every London borough is to be a rights respecting school and a rights respecting borough, and so there's lots there in terms of taking everything back to help us to remember about the child that's at the centre of everything that we're talking about, all of those themes, all of those prejudices, all of those biases. There's lots of really good, meaningful stuff that's happening. I still think that there is a challenge and an opportunity for us to collectively be able to engage in and meaningfully change what happens next. So part of the work that I'm really passionate about, and before life went sideways for us, before every single irrefutable societal truth that I had been given from my middle class South of England background was broken. Before that, there was I wasn't even a particularly political animal. You know, I had been given the messages that my right was important, women's suffrage, you know, had gained me that, and I engaged by exercising my right. And occasionally I would maybe go to a council meeting about something that bothered me, but that would be about it. I think part of the democratic movement has to include democratic engagement. And I think that there is a real opportunity here collectively to try and actively participate in and encourage a more nuanced conversation that is based on a broad church of knowledge. And actually, it's about actively listening to those on the margins. And those on the margins may have very extreme views, but we do need to consider, air them, and allow those conversations to happen. And as Azam said, get comfortable with being uncomfortable, with having those conversations and learning to agree disagreeably. No, the other way around, disagree agreeably. So there's something there. And I think I'm really keen to support and facilitate and foster the engagement so that we're not progressive education as something over there, or new learning communities as something that's on a satellite. Actually, there's so much great knowledge that's happening, so much enterprise and innovation that's there, that it's really important that we do that is actually incorporated and understood well in the conversations that are happening within structures of power. And I think what's really exciting at the moment, and I use that word lightly, I think what we witnessed with the US election has absolutely sent a shockwave in political and establishment circles, because what they've seen, that what we've all witnessed there, is individual citizens exercising their democratic right to be heard and to make a stand. And actually what that is leading to is some really deep thinking as to, okay, we may sort of think that home educators are a rarefied breed that we don't need to think about. This is the establishment sort of word, or maybe there's a movement over there that's so minoritized that actually they're not doing very much at anything of any interest. Whereas actually what has been demonstrated through the US election is that there is something very powerful within each individual to create something that matters and should be heard, or that is within a highly challenging narrative that actually the establishment has become so accustomed to tuning out from. So I think that there is what I'm really interested in is actually supporting the dialogue through that's happening and the enterprise and innovation that's happening in whatever area that it's happening around about for or with children and families and those that are working to educate, raise and nurture the future of our nations and our societies, and to help that democratic engagement. So participatory politics is something that I'm really interested in, and that there is more of an opportunity now than ever to help facilitate that and to share what you're doing. So I would encourage everyone that even when it feels like times are really dark, and I think at times we can witness, we're bearing witness, aren't we, to some really challenging narratives across Europe, actually, in terms of politics that feels discriminatory and narratives about us and about people that we know and care about that are really damaging. And in that landscape, we can become more segregated, we can become more entrenched, we can become further apart. But actually, in order for progression to be had, we do have to all collectively come together. And my call to arms to everyone here is that means working actively on the language that we use about those that are within the systems as well, and how we think about those that are within the systems and our own prejudices. Because I've had to work very hard to step into the room with the architects of the things that have created so much harm to my family and many families. And in order to do that, you have to really come in with a sort of blank sheet in your head. You can't go in with any sort of, you want to be heard. You have to think deeply about your argument, your purpose, your why. And equally, you have to know that whoever you're speaking to, they may be on a totally different place on their journey, but it is their journey. And that actually to respectfully come and try to engage with and understand their reasons, their why, their journey. And I think that is the challenge for everybody. We can go off and do our satellite things, and we can go off and do really beautiful things and want to share it. But equally, there is a, did you call it cultural humility? I love that. I'm constantly thinking, Adam, about, that the one thing that this work actively takes an enormous amount of capacity from me on is that I'm constantly humbled through conversations that I'm hearing, but also I'm aware that I have to check my humility. I have to sort of come into that space of deeply, of being humble, of actually coming to something not from a place of leadership, and yet I'm being asked to lead, to speak for, and all the rest of it. So I think in terms of what the opportunity is for this movement here today and this brilliant week that's happened is to deeply stretch and think about what you're doing, think about those core beliefs, review them constantly, but also be open, authentically open to engaging with those that don't share them.
Yeah, Ellie, can I just come on into one of those points, because I think that's it's so interesting listening to you talk there, and I think one of the things that always strikes me about possibly where we're up to in education at the moment is that in critical race theory, one of the interesting things we talk about is interest convergence. So progress tends to be made the most if we're thinking about issues around race when interests converge. So the interest of a dominant group converge with the interest of the movement themselves. And I tend to think that we are sort of at this point now, because what we're talking about, and this is no fault, by the way, so it's really important that any things we talk about, there's no blame. For Chris and I, Ellie's one of those people, she's never been in a classroom, she's never taught. How dare you have an opinion on education? I am joking, of course. Chris and I have spent time in classrooms. My time is based time served in school and everything else. But we talk about co-creation. We talked about that co-creation, and really in schools we haven't so far created time for that. I don't think that's any contentious argument. I don't believe there are many examples. I don't know of any where we've really co-created and listened to. The reason why our families and children at the end of it, maybe sometimes we consult if we're lucky. Very, very rarely do we co-create. I mention interest convergence because we seem to have reached almost a critical mass in education where actually no longer now in that order of three that we're talking about, is it just a certain type of child who is falling out of the crack of the system. That's fundamentally changed. At one point, it probably was that there was an archetypal type of child, a member of the family. Chris talked about it before, the sort of the even Plato's idea of there's three, the gold, bronze, silver type of gold, silver, bronze, even where you would fall into, and that determines things. What's happened now is in the education system that falling into that bronze section are children who are falling through the cracks from the middle classes. We've got talking about some interest convergence here, and Ellie and I have these types of conversations all the time. I think it's okay to unsettle and be comfortable in being uncomfortable. So Ellie, for example, is in a situation where she has some privilege, as all of us do here, by the way, who are sat in this call and sat in this webinar. And I think this is the interesting point now, where we now have a system that isn't just failing a certain demographic. So if I'm thinking about university, we look at the indices of multiple deprivation. It's not just affecting those families from quintiles 1 and 2. It's actually now affecting lots of other people. The system isn't working, whether it's attendance or actually some of the other, it's other kids coming into this. And this gives us a unique opportunity, because where Ellie, I think, is brilliant, is she, one, recognizes her positionality in that. So she never hides away from, yes, I have some privilege here. But it means that we are able to give a voice to what has been the voiceless for quite a long time, I would suggest. And that's really key and important for us. Alex was talking before about, her experience of children entering that sector and suddenly realizing, wow, this isn't just some extreme thing over here. 100% attendance. I mean, those of us who set a targets for anything, 100% can't be a target for anything. Do we ever do anything 100% of the times? I don't. I can't think of a single thing where I achieve some of these things. So I think we're at a key point that, from an interest convergence point of view, we have an opportunity now that, and this includes, by the way, sat with politicians and people who sat in power. There will be people who are sat in Parliament who the education system, despite all that privilege, their children are failing in said system. And it's important that we use that period of time where interests converge to really push forward on some of these things, because education is really complex. There isn't a single solution, but as Chris has said, we've been going through it for such a long time that it now is the moment really to capture that. And to go back and just pick on slightly, Ellie talked about, the situation, quite concerning situation, I would say, in American politics, and therefore actually broader than that, because we know American politics obviously ripple out beyond that. But let's not forget that here in the UK, we're not quite in that situation yet. And regardless of what your political viewpoints are or leanings are, we do seem to have a situation where education is back on the table, and it's not just that it's this conventional route of education, that there may be some other points to be able to look at and reflect. And that's a really key point, I think. But it is about, again, that idea of what can we do then to what the takeaways as such. And I think it is about stripping back and going back and having those types of conversations. So I've seen again in the chat that we think we agree co-creation is important, that centering some of those voices. How many times do we authentically sit and listen and remove our hierarchical structures, remove those things and listen to what does this feel like at the user, the service user end of this? And that's twofold, not just the children and young people, although that is absolutely key, but the families as well. And what could something differently look like? And if we are talking about things like attendance and things, where when we look and analyze that data, who are those families who are falling foul of said system? And rather than punishing them and being punitive, what are we doing to begin to understand some of that? And of course, in education, this is all very easy for me now, who's not subject to an Ofsted inspection, and I understand that. But when Ofsted do come knocking, and they will judge you on things like attendance, and we know that unfortunately that's going to be its own judgment. It sounds like its own separate judgment around something like attendance. Then actually having that narrative and being able to say, yeah, we've analysed this, we've looked at where our data and who was foul and fall of this system. We're showing some cultural humility, and we've been culturally competent. We've sat down, we're trying to unpick and understand, and we've actually worked properly with our families as to understand what was happening. And actually what we've got here is some case studies around how we're working with these families to say that actually, yes, their attendance might not be as good over here, but in terms of access to education, we're doing quite well because we've come up with this solution, because we've worked with that. These are the types of conversations I think that we have to be in. Now, it's difficult because I know what it's like being in school when you are bang, bang, bang and working through it. But if the answer is it's too challenging, well, okay, they're not okay really, but don't expect anything different to happen. The only way that a difference is going to happen, the only way that we get some different strategies is by doing something completely different. And I do think that co-creation of listening to the experiences, Ellie and I and Chris, and one of the privileges of being in the positions that we are in now, the roles that we have, I get to listen all the time to what it's like for people to be on the receiving end of our sector, from, as I say, primary years, early years, all the way into higher education, where I currently sit. And it is humbling to listen to what it's like to be churned out through a system that isn't working for you. And teachers don't have as much time for that. But what are we making time for? What are the things that we are valuing with our time that we could instead say, well, that's not really having a huge effect? And I think that's some of the challenge, Ellie, of maybe, yeah, really focusing our time and attention on what can matter. And honestly, I really would ask people to reflect on when was the last time that we didn't ask parents to come into our space, because schools, by the way, are loaded with as soon as you step foot over the threshold, lots of people are triggered by that very space and notion of it because of their experiences. So when was the last time that we actually thought, where are we going to find some neutral ground, and we're going to talk to the children, young people and families, and engage authentically and listen, and not respond straight away? Just listen to your story. What's it like? Why has that happened?
Yeah, we just so just to pick up on two things. There's a brilliant piece of work that I heard about that's happening up in Leeds. You'd love it, Adam, in terms of cultural competency, and they had hired Citizens UK to help their staff to go into active listening training, right? So, they realized that they weren't very good at listening. And this was a piece of work with the Gypsy Roma traveller community. And this wasn't all about attendance. This was actually deeply thinking, how can we make school a place where your children feel safe and where they want to be and where their identity is protected? And what can we do better? They've been through a 9-month program with community outreach and all the rest of it. And the phrase that came back, which I thought was so powerful and so humble as well, was that this process across the piece, from school leadership down to classroom teachers, they had said that it was institutionally chastening. And I thought that that was one of the most powerful phrases I'd heard in a long time, because it was accountable and it was reflective. And I think that so there was that piece of work, and there was something else that you said that hasn't come back to me. But Chris, are you able to talk about what great co-creation looks like? Because I think everyone would love to hear about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I love anyone who knows anything about me knows this is my bag, and I just wanted to share a few examples building on what Adam and Ellie just said of schools that are doing some really interesting work first. So clearly, anyone who's interacted with any of the learning communities and consent-based, self-directed, rights-respecting communities in the UK will see that this is lionized as a real core facet of practice, right? Listening authentically, co-constructing ways of being and acting. But there's this thing running at the moment called the Hub School Network, which is quite fledgling and has been going for about a year. But there are a number of schools in the UK that have blown my mind, really, in terms of how well they're doing this cultural competency and co-production work. And lots of others who are trying to do it and recognize, because we talk in a sort of tri-monthly workshops together, it's quite a strong sense of belonging. People are honest when they think they're not doing it very well, but want to do it. So I'll just give you 2 examples of that, and then I'll talk quickly about an example with young people that I've been involved with. So there's one school that did some beautifully innovative stuff where a community link worker went out onto the street with a sofa, a literal sofa, and spoke to some people that she knew in the local community. She lives in the local community herself, and said, where can I plonk this sofa where I'm going to be able to just talk to people in a completely open-ended way with a blank sheet of paper? And they do that every term. And from that, you start to build trust, you start to build rapport. They've devised all sorts of really interesting things with local community, things like dads groups. Anyone who's worked with dads knows it's really hard to engage dads, but by doing it flexibly and responsibly with some of the dads, they now have a dad support group. They run boot camps, they run breakfast clubs, they run food pantries. And all of that is run by volunteers in the community just through doing authentic co-production in a culturally competent way and listening to people. And there's another example called Arborthorne School. They won't mind me naming them. They're unbelievable in Sheffield. And they've got a community garden. They've got a community pantry run by parents. And the head teacher essentially works with parents to help them construct their own social enterprises in the local area. So they do everything from delivering food to homeless people to building all sorts of different activities within and outside the school at weekends to get kids off the street, because it's a very problematic area for them. There's lots of street violence and things. And it's all assets based, right? So what's going well in your community? How can we work closer with you as a community to then build things together that are going to best meet your needs? And we're going to publish something soon with 9 examples from around the UK. So watch this space for that, because there's some fantastic people out there doing this work. And
there really is. Oh, go on. So
no, I was just going to then talk about the sort of states of mind approach with young people. And as Adam pointed out, it's very difficult to snatch off time to do co-production work with young people in schools at the moment. But I think that states of mind, we found that if you build relationships with schools and you make them feel okay about asking difficult questions, you can do it. So we did a project called Breaking the Silence, where we worked with young people over 5 years, 5 different cohorts of young people, and we allowed them to ask their own research questions, explore ideas in their own way and at their own pace, and then construct solutions and disseminate them. And they've spoken at education select committees, they've been to Parliament, they've worked with their individual schools to change the way that the mental health care is constructed in those schools. And it really is magical and fantastic, but you have to start with no pre-designated outcomes. And the curriculum is essentially a process rather than an outcome. And the last thing I wanted to say is that the difficulty with this, I think, is that we still live in a world where most people are schooled. So when you think about what education is, most people jump in their minds unconsciously to standards, excellence, and competition. So doing this kind of work we're talking about now requires you to have a different worldview, right? That's based around values and ways of practicing that are somewhat contrary to the status quo. And that's obviously the challenge we've got, isn't it, at the moment, in terms of this group I think what we're trying to do is think about things differently, and I think it has to start with a very strong consensus with people doing really interesting work that can then be inspiring to others, whilst also having clear evidence that it works.
Yeah, for sure. I know. Yeah. So co-creation and co-production can go really badly wrong, right? It's really hard to get it right. And I would say that I would encourage anyone to really think about how you are facilitating, but also whether or not you have a space for authentic feedback in terms of how does this feel for everyone around the table, because you invariably may have one person who just doesn't align with that herd think at that point. And so having someone like Chris at the table to help really sort of ensure that everyone is authentically stretching their thinking, I think is really, really important. There was a comment in the chat that somebody had said that we are the frogs in boiling water. I've been thinking really deeply about the work that I've been doing over the last 5 years and the opportunity that I now have to speak to ex-civil servants and ex-private secretaries to the Prime Minister and people who are literally in the inner circle. And yeah, what is enormously eye-opening is that the civil service and parliamentarians, although I think what we saw under the last government was a contempt for the civil service, a contempt for society, and a very sort of narrow lens, which basically closed everything down and made everything shut down. But even when I spoke to people who've been working in the system, the higher echelons of the system during that administration, the last 14 years, what's clear is that there isn't this great conspiracy to kind of squeeze us and modify us and all the rest of it. It kind of isn't there. Not in the way that we externally, I think, frame it or how we feel it and then make sense of it in the stories that we tell ourselves about the motivations that are harming us. And I think these are sort of new thoughts that are bubbling through me at the moment, just when I'm having these discussions and I'm going away and I'm realizing that these are ordinary people that are turning up to do a job and turning up to think and turning up to create and turning up to write policy and all the rest of it. And of course, the road to hell is paved with good intentions and is littered with ignorance all along the way, right?
Do you know about the Carl Jung quote, Ellie? I'm paraphrasing.
Go on.
But people don't have ideology. Ideology has them. I don't think people are walking into this space, and that includes parents and teachers, wanting to harm.
No.
But as you said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And if you're proceeding from beliefs that are very problematic and have pernicious impacts on human beings, I would perceive it, grounded as it is in religion, to be akin to religious beliefs that the school system is founded upon that aren't really subject to rational challenge in some cases, personally.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I mean, I'm telling everybody about this podcast that I listened to earlier this year. I think it was in the autumn. I'm telling everyone to listen to it. I've become a bit of a sort of politics geek as a result of this work. As I said, I really wasn't a political animal at all. And I didn't understand local government, or I didn't understand systems change or any of that. But I've become slightly addicted to the rest is politics, with Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, and electoral dysfunction with Beth Rigby as well. Those two sort of I listen to. But the most life-changing podcast that I've listened to out of all of them is a podcast with a Taiwanese minister called Audrey Tang. And they're a non-binary child prodigy genius, as was tech billionaire. Everything that Elon Musk isn't, Audrey Tang is, diametrically opposed. Where Audrey Tang's story is really fascinating is their work with the Taiwanese government in order to improve co-creation, co-production, civic engagement. And what Taiwan 20 years ago, 15 years ago, was being crippled with a lot of public disorder. So there were a lot of protests. There was apparently a protest where 500,000 people overtook the Taiwanese capital and the government building with a sit-in for 2 weeks, and brought the country to a halt. The Taiwanese government, being democratic, kind of started thinking, shit, what are we going to do about this? And so what they did was they started really thinking about participation and the use of technology and AI, ethical AI, in order to ensure that facilitated discussions were actively captured from all views with listening sessions, and so that everybody felt heard and understood, and so that consensus could be agreed to get stuff done. Whatever that thing is that you wanted to solve, that you wanted to talk about, you could get that stuff done. And what they've done is they've turned around lack of trust in government and systems, but also they facilitated that engagement. And what they've done is they've changed lack of public trust from something like I want to say 17%, but I think it might be 14%, to 70% in a decade. So really, really interesting stuff. And I think for anybody, again, who's interested in how that might be possible in the UK, if you're not already aware of the Cooperative Party, please do take a look at it. It's the sister party within the Labour Party, but it's all about community engagement to build solutions for your context to get stuff done. But also there's loads of announcements that are happening around cooperative and mutual benefit societies and that sort of thing, which is where Square Peg is going to be moved. It's where I've always wanted Square Peg to be as an organisation, is a community benefit organisation that is deeply ethical in its practice. So I think that there's loads there that sort of riffs on all this, but I'm going to stop talking now. Yeah,
I think Ellie, as you talk about the sort of the cooperative party and all those types of things, I think it is important again to sort of frame almost where so education is often kicked around like a political football, and you get again in sessions when I'm trying to interact, I normally talk off about and ask people to name all the education secretaries of state for education since Gavin Williamson. It's only a couple of years, and yet that's really, really challenging, particularly if you start to ask them to do it in order. I actually know it, but only because I've asked it so many times. And the point that I'm always trying to make, obviously, is that it's important not for us to be so led on a whim of any different government direction in too much, whilst also still fulfilling that. But I think it's important as well to see that over a period of years, and I'm going to try to not be too political by saying what the period of time, but let's say in the last 15 years or so, the education has moved down a certain way, and we've seen it in every way, shape and form. So if I think back to, I moved from being in school and being a deputy head, etc., to move into initial teacher education, and looking at the direction of travel that training went for our teachers. And I think there's also a danger that we've really tried to get to, that there is a way to teach and it's this way. I could be really facetious and say, it's in a book and that you teach like a champion and this is the way you go here. This isn't to have a sole go. It is quite a low dig, that, I suppose. And it's not to have a dig at this one idea. There's some really interesting ideas around practice around that. But this idea that there is a way to teach and it can be taught from a textbook suggests that it's a homogenous group of people that we teach to, and it's much, much more difficult than that. It comes back to the point before around research informed practice. What research informed practice might look like in your school might be very different to my school and context. And I think we've got to get back to those things. Yes, we do have standardized curriculum, etc., which we do have to work within. But there's guidance documents and we can work within those things. In the chat as well, one of the things I think, what things that we can do, people have been talking about the curriculum review and the consultation around that. Let's get our voices heard around those types of things. It's important to feed into the different opportunities that we have to feed into those things as well. Make sure that we feed into the curriculum review, make sure we are getting our voices heard from that, but also to really again, and what does authentic co-creation look like? Think about that in your setting, and really start to think about, I think someone mentioned in there, why does, you know, parental consultation always look like come in for some coffee and a cake? Yeah, great question. Why does it? In fact, actually, where is it we will find groups of our parents? And there's no answer to that. It depends on your setting. If you were in a village school, it will look very different to where you might find some of your parents, to where you are in a city school. It might look the same. It's some of those questions, and I think it's challenging that the notion that communities aren't difficult to engage with, but services are. Services are difficult, and we're a service. Education is difficult to engage with, and it's flipping that narrative, I think, to actually, you know, how are we going to authentically engage with the people on the other end of it, the people who aren't quite who aren't slipping through this system that we're churning them through, and I think it is that slight reframing. Chris has talked about some really good examples of co-creation, and I think that's the thing of going back to where we have our spheres of influence, because that's the other thing of that it can be really frustrating to. So we've got a system that needs a paradigm shift, and how can I shift the paradigm? And I came out of education for those types of reasons, feeling frustrated that I can't change it all. But what are the things within our gift to change? How can we work better individually with the families and communities that we are working with, and questioning some of that? And again, the time poor thing, and I put into the chat, just have, yes, we are time poor, and yes, we haven't got lots of time for reflection. But when can we build some things in? When can we ask whose voice is missing from this conversation? We're having a conversation today about whatever it is, our attendance policy, or we're talking about curriculum, or whatever it is. Where are the people whose voices that we need to hear? Because these are the people who are going to be impacted by the policy that we're moving through. And how often do we actually do that from the ground up? Build something that we can say we co-created this policy, and it's the best at the moment we think we can get it, although it's going to adapt and evolve because we created it with the people who it's going to impact, to the service users at the end of it. I think that's absolutely key. I keep on trying to, Ellie, come back to the idea that we're not just a talking shop, and we're not just talking at these high level ideas, and instead saying, empowering, that we do have it within our gifts and our spheres of influence to make some incremental change, however small those steps might be. We know what the shared goal is. We've got different strategic steps we're going to have to take along the way to be able to begin to achieve it.
Exactly that.
Yeah, go on,
go for it, Alex.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, I'm just diving in because it's been a really interesting discussion, and I know there's been lots of comments in the chat and stuff, and I'd love to grab some questions from anyone who has questions in the chat for these three. But before we sort of came live, you mentioned, Ellie, about asking the audience questions. So I'm just wondering if you had a question that you'd like to ask people to answer in the chat, given the co-creation and your call to action of, like, what can you do next? You know, what would you like to ask of the people who are attending today?
I suppose my invitation to everybody here is, how do you feel enabled or disabled in sharing what you do? So obviously there's progressive education and the ambition there with the new offer, which sounds amazing. But is there anything else that you need in terms of, or you would like in place in terms of sharing what you do? Is there anything that if you could magic one question, if you could wave the magic wand, what might that look like in terms of supporting you to share your interests, your passions, your work? What might that look like?
Oh, that's a really good question. So that's one for people to just pop your answer to in the chat. If you had a magic wand, what would you do, or how would you be able to share your interests and passions, or the work that you're doing? So it'd be lovely to see what people say to that in the chat. And what a great way to think about, you know, co-creating, not just sort of changing the education, but co-creating what we're doing here today in terms of, you know, kind of thinking of ways to build this conversation even further, really.
I would also say, and after Chris left the conversation, Adam and I carried on for at least another hour, Chris, last week. couldn't stop talking. But I was saying to Adam, we really do need to hold on to hope, right? We've got to hold on to hope, because things feel like they're just getting darker and darker and darker. And I don't mean that in a trite way. I believe that humanity will prevail. I have to believe that, because if I don't think that we're going to prevail, that and that we're going to find a way through this for the benefit of future generations, then yeah,
there's tons of hope, Ellie. Tons of hope.
There is.
I think if you think about the way I think about it, to give myself hope, is that before the 1940s, education for all would have seemed completely and utterly ludicrous to any politician, anyone in any position of authority, whether they be middle-class bourgeois or aristocratic or parliamentarian or any of those areas. But now, every single human being, pretty much around the world, believes that all human beings have an equal say, in theory, but at least access to education. That's not very long ago. And what we've got at the moment is two competing ways of conceptualizing the world. And the different reason co-creation is so hard is because what maybe gets missed sometimes when we talk about this is, to actually do co-creation, you have to have had a paradigm shift in your mind. You can't conceive pedagogy in the way that teachers are conditioned to do if you want to do co-creation, because that's all about having a preconceived outcome and teaching chalk and talk. So to actually do that, you first got to completely reconceptualize what being a human being is and how you relate to others, and certainly what learning and education is. And that's the challenge, and that's why these conversations are really important, and that's why people like those involved with prog ed and other different forms of what you might now call alternative education is super important, because you're demonstrating that it's workable, completely non-harmful, and actually aligns much better with people's fundamental human needs for things like belonging, self-determination, feelings of competence. And that's really hopeful. I've never seen more people doing this than there is at the moment. I've never seen more people persistently speaking out against the school system. And again, just another little historical flag here that's really interesting is it's only in the 1970s that we had a fully comprehensive education system, and we still don't have that. We were talking last week, Adam, weren't we, around the fact that we don't have that everywhere. We still have grammar schools. So we're still in a transition process, really, to a phase where any form of what you might call equity in education is even plausible. And I think we need to probably be a bit kinder to ourselves in thinking how fast this is just going to change, because it's not going to change overnight. But I think these conversations are the change. They are the process. And if you think about how human beings work, and I'm obviously a psychologist geek, so I'm always thinking about it in terms of consciousness. And our consciousnesses have got to shift collectively before we can get to the point where people can actually believe in a form of education that doesn't involve standards and accountability and all of the things that come alongside that. So I have tons of hope, and I think an enormous amount of progress has been made since the 1950s when we had education for all. And if you think that before that, someone like me from Kidderminster, I would have been in the carpet factory all my life if I was been born 50 years earlier. That's a really hopeful thought.
Yeah, I one of my slides at the moment is a sort of a scenic landscape of mountains and alpine trees and a blue sky. And I think I realized when we fell out of education 10 years ago, my eldest was first and then followed by my youngest 2 years later. One of the motivations why I got involved at a local strategic level was so that I hoped in my naivety that I could kind of improve services quick enough for my kids to benefit. And you realize quite quickly that that's not going to happen. And because that sort of change takes a long time, and you start sort of realizing that it's not really all that helpful to sort of go in, I wanted to do it for every child, but I was motivated for my children as well, just full disclosure. Whereas now, my kids are, 18, well, 19 next month, and, you realize that the time is passing. But anyway, to go back to the glacier kind of idea, people and myself included, feel so frustrated that the rate of change is glacial. It's really, really slow. And that's because we have a parliamentary democracy. There is process. There is so many systems that are bound up in the process of change. But that actually, you know, I sort of really love the idea. I remember learning about glaciers in my GCSE geography, and actually they carve mountains. So you may not even see the glaciers change when you're coming up and you're standing there. But generations later, or even 5 or 10 years later, that glacier has literally carved rock. And I think collectively, that's a really lovely idea to kind of go, we're standing on the shoulders of predecessors and predecessors, and actually we're changing the landscape. We're carving the horizon as we go.
I think it's so important. I've just been looking in the chat, and I can see both, you know, people talking about, I think the optimism really comes through, but I know Andy's talked about the biggest disabler is almost emotional load, and that comes with change, and I agree. I think there's a couple of things around that really. I think it's I think ideally finding a place, finding the right place is important, because being in the right environment for change is key. I've been really, really fortunate that I've navigated my career in different places where that change and disruption has been required and wanted. There was a need for it, so it's finding that at the right time. But where that isn't possible, and we have to be realistic, if we can't all just be constantly changing and everything else, I come back to questions of when I am looking at change, or where we're creating policy or anything else, and we're thinking about children and young people. A question that I always come back to ask leaders is just who benefits from what you've just what you're talking about. Who benefits from the current this thing that you're proposing? Tell me who benefits from that. Now, if you've got really clear beneficiaries and you can articulate it, okay, let's have a conversation around that. But so often when it comes to school, and so, you know, if we are about to, you know, I'm a governor now, and if someone was talking about rising their attendance target, and we talk about those things because the attendance target that they set as a school is slightly below the national benchmark, even though they overachieve it. Who benefits from raising that target? It's, you know, and when you start to frame things in those questions and ask leaders these types of questions, I think that's where change starts to come, because often our drivers, sometimes we've lost sight of what the driver is, and the driver is supposed to benefit, as far as I can see. Well, it depends. It's either there's real hope and we are trying to change a system that doesn't work for enough people, or we're all complicit and part of a system that's failing on purpose. And I'd like to think that it's the former, not the latter, that we're talking about. So I think sort of picking up on some of the points raised in the question about the optimism again, I think it comes from what the things that we can do and we can say, and the provocations and the challenge that we can push on in our spheres of influence, just to ask those questions. Who benefits from this? Whose voice is missing from this at the moment? We're making this, who's going to be on the end of this particular policy decision, or whichever it is? Have we asked them about it? How do we know? Because no other time would we do that, really. You know, we'd always at least consult a little bit if co-creation is too difficult an aim to go for. So I think there are tangible things that we can do, and I'm with you. I think there's a scale of 1 to 10. How strongly do we think that co-creation is a vehicle to paradigm shift? I don't think I can give it in a 1 to 10 frame. What I'd say would be that, because I don't think there are that many examples of where true, authentic co-creation has been shared. Chris has got some within the hub, and that's wonderful. I've got less examples of that, if I'm honest. That becomes more of a low-hanging fruit. We haven't explored some of the avenues yet for that paradigm shift. So I'm really hopeful of at least beginning to truly do some of that. True co-creation really gives a chance for a paradigm shift. So I'm with Ellie and Chris of being really hopeful of what might come afterwards.
Brilliant. I loved that question, actually, because I thought that's the hardest thing, isn't it, to put a score on how hopeful you are. But it sounds like you all actually have quite a lot of positive energy towards that. I've got a question for each of you, though, which is and it's sort of related to that question, which is, given that you are hopeful about a paradigm shift for conventional setups, what does that sort of, I wouldn't say necessarily utopia, but if you were to see into the future 10 years, what would that school or education environment look like? Maybe I'll start with Chris on that one.
I think the key thing is something Adam was saying earlier, which is it's not going to look the same everywhere. And I think one of the things that is absolutely clear about, if you look back through human history about what education means, it's only in very, very recent years, a few hundred years, in fact, where there's been this idea of standardizing anything. So the entire history of Homo sapiens, and even going back to our ancestors, Neanderthals, etc., if you look at the things that you find when you dig up their remains, is you find evidence of flint knapping by children. So they're getting taught to knap stone tools. You can see that young people have had play areas where they've been dumping these little bits. This is all theoretical, but most archaeologists are agreed on that. And this is hundreds of thousands of years ago. If you went into those communities and went, we're going to make you learn something, regardless of whether it's relevant or not, because we think it's the right thing for you to learn, and if you don't do it, we're going to punish you. They might have shrugged. They might have butchered them with a club. I don't know. Wouldn't have gone well. But this idea of standardizing education, it's very much marinated in Christian history. And this idea that if everyone doesn't learn the same thing in the same way, in the same words, at the same pace, and at the same time, the world will fall to pieces and we will invite in the devil. That's where this comes from. So we're at a place at the moment where we're starting to recognize that that's completely absurd. Everybody knows, even the most highly conditioned supporter of the status quo, I'm sure would agree that a standardized curriculum is an inappropriate way of proceeding, and standardized approaches in general are an absurd way of proceeding. So I think we're in a point now where we've had this for a few hundred years. People battled to have this extended comprehensive school education. We've won that battle. Everyone should get education. We've agreed that. The next thing is, how do we make that applicable and worth enhancing for everybody? And I think that's the next thing. And I think what over the next 10 years, to go back to your question, Alex, what we're going to see is more and more people innovating outside the system and within the system to push back against these standardized narratives. Because what we've learned as a society is all that does is cause untold harm and suffering to thousands and thousands of families and young people and educators themselves, who are told don't smile before Christmas and have to turn themselves into this policeman-like figure of authority. So I think what we're going to see is more innovation and more pushback, and less and less people want to become teachers, more and more teachers leaving early. The whole system is kind of crumbling, and this is what happens with institutions when they stop working. So we're going to see also more crumbling, and that's where people like Ellie come in to go to politicians and go, look at this thing going on over here. So again, that leads back to the hope. But the main sentence I've used to finish that little rant is that it's only in recent years that there's been any sense that learning and education should be anything other than localized. And I think we're moving to a point now where we're realizing that we need to pull that back. And that's not because we want to recreate the Stone Age. It's because the best way for human beings to thrive is in a nested set of relationships where they have some sense of control about what things look like.
Yeah. Adam, I'm going to pose that question to you now.
Yeah, I mean, I love everything that Chris said, and the move away from standardization. Absolutely. I think there would be a place of a utopian sort of, we've got to some amazing system. Number one, and this is a key area of interest for me as well, I guess that our teaching profession would look more like the diverse world that we live within. So we'd be more representative of society, not just ethnically diverse, although that would be something that we would really be pushing towards, but diversity of thoughts, diversity of experience, and all of those things. Certainly a move away from standardized testing, I think, and focusing on some of the key issues. But I suppose rather than going on, I am gonna do word salad, I'm afraid, to finish off, and I apologize. But I guess falling back on there isn't going to be an end goal, that we're always going to be evolving, and what we think we know now is going to look very different, and we'll probably laugh at those things afterwards. I say this all the time of, you know, we laugh now, don't we? Who thought there were different types of learners, visual, audio, and kinesthetic? Ha 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 ha. In 10 years' time, or 15, or however long, we'll be laughing at cognitive science things and laughing at we did retrieval practice and thought that was wonderful, or those things. What we know now is we're gonna laugh at in the future. So it's always going to involve. But ultimately, it's got to come back to then, hasn't it, to some core principles that education should empower, not conform. It's got to nurture, not punish. And we've got to prepare learners to change and engage in the world and not just fit into it. And the current system asks for we want to conform and squeeze things through. And as you know, Ken Robinson talked about a long time ago, another proud Scouser, by the way, but talked about a long time about educational paradigms. We're making far too many brilliant people believe that they're not. And that fundamentally goes against what we came into it for. So I think the idea of conforming and squeezing through all these standardized things, standardized curricula, standardized this, it removes some of that, and it's adaptive and it evolves and it's built from the ground up and it's co-created. And yeah, all of that is very, how is that achievable? Well, let's try in small incremental steps, because currently, and I said this in the chat before, for a research informed, in inverted commas, profession, the research tells us, the data tells us that by every conceivable metric, it is not working. So let's stop looking for things and say that we've got something that tells us it's not working, and let's make some incremental steps. Doesn't have to be these huge things, but incremental steps that for me starts off with authentically co-creating with our families and parents. And it can start in things like attendance, or we can start in things like curricula, and build and see what that looks like, and stop trying to squeeze everyone through a system, because it doesn't work. And do we really want to be part of a system that has that gold, silver and bronze embedded into things from the outset? So I remain hugely positive. But I do think that utopia, or the journey towards it, I don't think the utopia is possible because there's no end goal. It'll always change, but we can get there. And thanks, Alex, for hosting as well. It's been great. Thank you.
No worries. Ellie, I want to hear your final thoughts on what our education system could look like in 10 years, or if it's glacial, maybe you want to stretch that to 20 or 30 years in the future.
Yeah. But so I was going to say that standardization came in order to try to bring in an equitable education experience. This is the irony of the whole thing. It was an effort to make sure that we could reliably, as families, know that what our child was accessing was equitable and was reliable. You know, it was the same. This is the thing. And there was so much variation in the system that they kind of said, okay, let's just make sure that everyone's doing the same. And of course, that doesn't necessarily translate into an equitable education experience. That's the irony of the whole thing. And you can't measure it equitably. You know, the whole thing is just bonkers. So I'm all up for evolution. I'm kind of a little bit, I tend to be a bit of a frightened rabbit, and I do get a bit scared about when we're talking about revolutionary things, because I'm a pragmatist and I'm a realist, and I know that if you look at across time, the number of revolutions that have actually happened and been successful in their aims is like, I can't name one actually. Well, no, okay, French Revolution, you know, but anyway, whatever. There's a couple there, but I think for me, the way I frame things now in terms of my glacial thinking is that we are on a quest. We're on a quest, and we don't actually know. Particularly, we kind of got an idea of where we're going. We've got an idea, but we don't actually know what the horizon looks like. So, you know, we might get over that hill, exactly as Asma said, we might get over that hill. 5 years have gone by and everything's changed again. So we've got to be adaptive, we've got to be responsive, we've got to remain humble, you know, and I think that, you know, what are the things that I'd like to see really in the next 5 years? Okay, 10 years. I really hope, and I think that this is important to kind of really latch onto. A week ago today, the Education Secretary said, the Secretary of State, for Education said that school wasn't just about results, that it was about belonging, and it was about children's well-being and happiness. We haven't had that language for a long, long time. And that was a clear indication that actually they know that unhappy children become unhappy, ill adults and have really poor life outcomes. And we're seeing that across the socioeconomic divide. Mental health is indiscriminate. It doesn't choose whether or not you've got a bank balance. So that's really important to hold on to. But you are more likely to experience those additional vulnerabilities if you come from a place of adversity and from racial and societal inequality. So we know that. But I think that we do have an opportunity so for me, in summary, because my brain's gone to mush now, but I would hope that we are focusing on children's well-being, more rights respecting, that we are actually working towards children being treated as equitable individuals. They may have inelegant and unformed, fully formed brains, but the power of their insight and to tell us what's going on, and also their reflective thinking and their adaptive thinking, is something beautiful to behold. I hope we come to a point where we realize that we're here to learn from kids rather than to teach kids everything that they need to know. That would be a nice principle to sort of get at the center of things. And that actually we have a sector and a workforce that is diverse and broad, and that is supportive of everyone in it. And actually, once you start sort of stripping back to anyone, the most traumatized, rigid adult has a backstory as to how they got there. So if they're really sort of nice and behaviorist and thinking about keeping everything on rails, that is the survival response to try to make sense of some sort of experience or chaos that they've been through, because order makes sense. So order is safe. So for me, I think, I haven't really answered it very well at all. It's a load of word salad. but I'm trying to sort of come on to the fact that I think it is about a prioritization of children's well-being and voice. And let's not forget that actually we respect and treat families equitably, no matter who they are or where they come from, and we involve them at the center of what happens. We've got to have systems that are built for the most vulnerable, that everyone else benefits from.
Yeah.
Et voila.
Fantastic. What a fascinating discussion you three have brought to the table today. There's been so many topics that we've covered. I feel like we've talked about well-being, we've talked about co-creation, we've talked about political activism, we've talked about cultural cultural competence. I love that terminology. So much to think about. So I hope everyone here has got their brains spinning now on all these different topics. Thank you, all three of you, for coming on today. It's been absolutely fascinating. As a thank you for everyone who's logged in today as an attendee, we also have a little prize which we'd like to award now. So we have a signed copy of the book that Ellie co-authored, called Square Pegs: Inclusivity, Compassion and Fitting In, a Guide for Schools. So, but it's not just for schools, it is for everyone, and it's a really, really fantastic book. So I'm just going to grab who the winner of that book is today. And we have Shashi. Congratulations, Shashi. Get in touch with us. Send us an email at info@educationstartups.org and we'll get your address and get that sent out to you. Congratulations. And one other thing just to mention is, if you'd like to buy yourself a copy of that book, if you want the winner today, you can do that on the Crown House Publishing website. All attendees at the summit have been given 20% off buying books on that website using the code INSPIRE20. So you can head over to crownhouse.co.uk and grab a copy of Square Pegs on there for 20% off. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. Our next session is running this evening. So we've got one more to round off the week, 7:30 p.m. GMT with Gina Riley, who's an educational psychologist, a program director and a researcher at the City University of New York. and she's undertaken extensive research on homeschooling and unschooling, so stuff that's really outside of the mainstream schooling system, but which many people are turning to now as a viable alternative. So if you can make it along to there, that would be absolutely fantastic. We'll see you there. And one other thing to mention, which some of you may be aware of, is that today is the final day to submit your responses to the curriculum and assessment review in the UK. So if you've been fired up about the conversation here today, go and find, I think Joe dropped a link in the chat, go and find that curriculum and assessment review and have your voice heard, because as Ellie said, we need to be bringing these voices out to make change in the system. Now we've run until almost 1:45, so we've only got a little while for networking, but I would still love for anyone who'd like to stay on and chat to other attendees, chat to Ellie and Chris and Adam, who are going to stay on for the final 15 minutes. Do hang around. I will stop the recording in a moment, and so that we can unmute ourselves and show our screens and say hello to each other.